Welcome to Best Business Partners with Jess and Erin. We are here with a wonderful attorney here in town, Kevin Kyle, who's also, how many generations Fort Myers?
I'm first, actually.
You are?
Yeah.
Well, he has everybody knows the Kyles. I mean, they're like the notorious family.
Yes, yes.
But welcome, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about you and your background and what you do and everything else.
So I was actually born in Fort Myers. My parents moved here in 1964 from Indiana. They hated the cold. And it is cold today by my standards.
Yeah, I just said that to my client from Minnesota. He said, you should come up here. I said, no, thank you.
Yeah. So obviously I grew up here, finished Harrel in 1986. Then I went to Emory University in Atlanta, got an accounting degree, decided I would go to law school. I went to the University of Florida for law school, finished there in 93. Then I went to NYU for a one-year degree in tax law.
Ooh.
Met my wife, who drove me to Los Angeles for 4 years. Then I drug her back to Fort Myers.
Who we absolutely love.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I do too.
You better say that.
So I started doing in LA what I do here now. I represent a lot of retirees. I help them with their estate planning and their general day-to-day legal needs if they have any. And I represent a lot of business owners and help them with their day-to-day business needs, as well as help them with their estate planning and financial planning as well.
Oh, I didn't know the business side. I like that. Interesting. Good to
Learning
know.
something new already. We're only 1 minute in.
Well, he's done a lot of work for me and my family personally, but so we obviously in real estate we deal with a lot of the estate probates, fun stuff.
Yeah.
We have a lot of the elderly retirees here locally, so we get a lot of those that pass on and leave their inheritance to their children or the estate somehow. And so we're constantly calling you going, how quick can you get us through probate?
Yeah.
Correct, yeah. Unfortunately, that happens.
More than we would like.
And I just recently found out, so somebody had said everything has to go through probate no matter what. And I said, okay. And we recently found out there was a trust left where there was no probate, and so that was new, because most of ours go through probate. We kind of have to always put in the contract, subject to probate, so I'm interested in finding out a little bit more about what evokes that probate and how you can get around it and those kind of things. So I'm excited about this podcast. So
Sure. Well, here's what probate is. Probate's the process when someone dies. If they have an asset that's titled just in their name, there's no joint owner having rights of survivorship, and there's no beneficiary on it, such as some bank accounts you can go in and make them transfer on death to somebody. You can tell the bank, hey, if I die, pay it to this person.
right.
You can actually do that on a deed too, with what's called a Lady Bird deed. We might talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
And if the asset's not in a trust or payable to a trust, then it has to go through probate. And probate's simply the process of going to the judge downtown saying, this person died, here's their death certificate, here's their will if they had one. If they didn't have a will, they die what we call intestate. And then we have to prove to the judge who the heirs are, number one. Then once the executor is appointed, that person will pay the decedent's final debts, final taxes, final expenses, and then, depending who the heirs are, go, here's your share, your share, your share.
Right.
So it takes a lot of time. In Florida, it does take an attorney typically to go through the process,
Right.
unless you try to do a summary probate, which is a very simplified type of probate. So it takes a lot of time, effort, and energy, and unfortunately money, because unfortunately attorneys don't work for free.
Shucks.
Yeah. My wife likes to play tennis, so I have to give her what she needs to play tennis, right?
There you go.
So tell me the difference between probate on just any estate and then one that's in homestead as a primary. Is there a difference?
There can be a difference, and that's where a lot of the nuances come into people, particularly for what you do, because you'll see people who move down here, spend their 10 years, 20 years in the sun, then die, and they've not done any planning with the homestead. So to back up a little bit, there's two types of probate in Florida. There's a formal probate where if someone dies owning more than $75,000, excluding the homestead, you have to go through a whole process of having an executor appointed. The correct term in Florida is actually personal representative. And then that personal representative collects the assets, pays the bills, and then says, here's your share, your share. If an estate has less than $75,000 excluding the homestead, there's a summary probate or a simplified process where an executor is not actually appointed. The judge just issues an order saying, here's who's entitled to the money or the assets, go get it. Homestead is a very unique creature of Florida law. So homestead is important, generally speaking, for 3 reasons. As I'm sure you talk about with people buying, you have the homestead exemption for property tax purposes, which generally limits your property tax increase to 3% a year. Number 2, there's an exemption from creditor claims for your homestead. Basically in Florida, it's impossible for someone to take your home from you unless it's the government for taxes, of course, including the IRS. You stiff the plumber, the roofer, the contractor, or if it's a bank, obviously holding a valid mortgage. Those are really the only 3 groups of people who can take your home from you. But in Florida, too, there's a 3rd set of rules. There's a very particular set of rules that say who you can and can't leave your home to in Florida. If you're survived by a spouse or a minor child, number 1. And then 2, when you're dealing with homestead, those creditor exemptions come into play, too, because they don't just apply while you're alive, they apply when you're dead, too. So that's where homestead becomes very tricky because people, I have one right now, the facts are this, lady dies, she leaves everything to her 7 siblings, it's her homestead, but because it's homestead and just in her name, I do have to file a probate action, but technically the probate judge will issue an order leaving the homestead to, in this case, to the 7 siblings, but because it's exempt from creditor claims, then it technically becomes the property of all 7 people who then have to work together to sell, as opposed to it passing, so to speak, to the personal representative or executor who can then work with the 2 of you to sell it. So it becomes a much more complicated process.
That's interesting. So, first of all, what I got is if you die, you still have to pay your bills.
Generally speaking, there's ways around that too. You come see me if you really feel that strongly about it.
Creative thinking. But so it can go a lot of ways. But how you take title, how you take your deed, is vital.
It can be very important. You know, it goes back to how do we avoid all this process of probate, whether formal or summary. How do we avoid where I have to have 7 siblings sign off on the sale of a home? There are ways to do it. You know, people will do trusts. They'll set up trusts, put their home into a trust, so that way the trustee can hopefully sell it. You can put someone on a lady bird deed. I'll have people that say, hey, it's my home as long as I'm alive, and when I die, it goes to this person or persons. That avoids probate. So there's a lot of different ways to avoid probate. There's not a best way. I think it just depends upon your needs, your goals. And again, there's a lot of nuances too when you have minor children that come into play. That's probably not mostly what you all deal with, but when people do come in, they have a spouse and a minor child, it makes it even more complicated.
Another reason I should have a spouse. Super simple. Adult children and no spouse. They're set.
No, that's not true.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So
sidebar.
Pros and cons to everything.
There is pros and cons to everything. That's fair. That's fair. So, in a lot of, obviously every case is different. I mean, or has different. The trickiest thing I have found every time I call you and we do have to announce and do the whole go through the heirs and find all the heirs and all that. What designates an heir? If there's no will, obviously there's no will, how do you know who to send these notices to?
That's a good question. So what happens then when somebody dies without a will, the legal terms, they die what we call intestate or without a will.
Okay.
So there's a statute under Florida law that says if you die without a will, here's who inherits your property. And most cases it's very easy because people die, down here they typically, if I'm probating, are widows or widowers and they have children. And I just have to map out a family tree, which can be hard in some cases because people forget about the child they haven't seen in 20 years or problem I have sometimes is this person is my child, and it turns out they weren't. They were just treated as a child. They weren't adopted. So it can become very complicated. You just have to map out a family tree typically to say, okay, here's who they are, and tell the judge.
Okay.
It
So
becomes,
what if there's no children?
well, there's no children. So the statute really works like this. If somebody died and they're married,
Okay.
generally speaking, half goes to the spouse and half goes to the kids. With the exception being that if the surviving spouse and the decedent, all their children are in common,
Okay.
then everything goes to the spouse. So that's why you have to kind of know is someone married and then map out their family tree to say, okay, here's where it goes.
Right.
If someone is unmarried or they don't have any descendants, it can be very complex because generally speaking, then it goes to parents or the survivor of the parents, then to siblings or siblings descendants. If there are no siblings or siblings descendants, then it goes out to aunts, uncles, cousins.
I remember
it
we
can
had
become
one of
very
those.
complex.
Okay.
And you were sending it to cousins, nieces, nephews, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
oh, good heavens, we'll be here until.
I had one with 40 cousins.
Oh,
It
wow.
was terrible. The guy just wouldn't do a will. I never knew him. He died. The case was brought to me to probate. But apparently he just would not do a will and just said,
Wow.
whoever in the family gets it, gets it. And there were like 40 of them.
Each got
So-
a dollar.
That was a very hard sale to do.
That was, I can
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah, I can barely wrangle 5 or 6 people
Yeah.
together, much less 40. So if you were to give advice to people, you know, there's no too young of an age to do a will.
No.
You should really have your ducks in a row well in
Correct.
advance. Is what.
Everybody really should have at least a simple will to say, hey, if I die, here's where everything should go,
Right.
number one. Number two, they should have a power of attorney that just says, hey, if I have a stroke or I'm incapacitated, here's who's in charge. And number three, they should have a document that does the same thing for my medical decisions if I cannot, number one. And two, it should state, what do I want done if I'm terminal with cancer, for example, I'm end stage, let's say ALS, or I'm vegetative or brain dead. Do you want the plug pulled? Do you want everything done to keep you going?
Yes.
Those are the three
Freeze
basic
you.
documents.
Parents get frozen.
Some people do that.
I think something you've never written one
I've
up.
had people say, do everything it takes, even if it takes my last dime.
No.
Because somebody was like, they could come out with the miracle the
Quite
next
honestly,
day.
I might be that guy.
I was just gonna say, that's probably Jessica. We're not gonna disclose, but that's.
Everybody has their own
Yeah.
course when it
I'm
comes
like,
to
no.
this stuff.
Throw me in the
Unplug.
freezer next to
Pull
Walt.
plug and.
I want to make sure that I get all of my chances.
But for the homes, it's if you have a basic will, it's better than
Right.
nothing.
Yeah.
It does make it a little easier. A trust is, to me, the easiest way to do it. Set up a revocable trust, put your home in it, and assuming there's no minor children or marital issues, that's probably the easiest way to handle homestead.
Okay, and so doing that, when you do the trust and somebody comes to you and they're green, they have nothing. They say, we need this stuff to get our lives in order. Do you record it? How do we have documentation? How do they go follow through with that to make sure that, because when we talk to somebody, our first thing is, can we see a copy of your trust?
Well,
So
we
we
do
know
the
what
trust, and then typically we will do the deed that puts the home in the trust. We'll typically give the client copies of everything, of course, so they'll have the trust, they'll have the deed. They'll typically have what's called a trust certificate, which is kind of an abbreviated version of the trust they can give somebody if they don't want to give the whole trust.
But it's not
agreement
recorded
out.
with the county or the
The
state.
deed is
or anything.
recorded,
The deed
of
is,
course.
right,
The trust
right.
itself is not. Some people will record the trust certificate if necessary, but they don't record the whole trust.
So I ask those things because, one, I know, but also so many people that are listening don't know, and they're worried that I get a lot of, well, I don't want anyone to know my business. I get that.
Trust is pretty private. It's a lot more private than probate, because probate, generally speaking, I can go look everything up. If I want to see the person's will, I can go do it. If I want to go see who filed claims, I can do it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
Can I go back real quick to the very first
Sure.
thing you said when there's no probate needed? You said they've set it up either in a trust or a will with no one mentioned in that?
no, so the trust will generally say, in most cases, pay my debts, taxes, and expenses. If my spouse is alive, he or she gets everything. If my spouse is deceased, my kids get everything.
Gotcha.
In that case, in the normal case down here, the kids are all adults. Son or daughter steps in as a successor trustee. They're the only person who has to deal with selling the house in most cases.
Got it.
It's sold, the money's distributed, easy peasy.
Yeah.
If there's a will, if it's homestead in that scenario, then I have to go probate it, and then that's when the homestead order comes in, switches the title to 3 or 4 or 5 kids, whatever. Then you're dealing with 3 or 4 or 5 sellers.
Okay.
And that scenario is a little less time consuming with the courts than a standard probate.
It can be, again, it depends on what other assets there are. If there's over $75,000 in cash I have to probate, for example,
Right.
then it's harder.
Yeah, sure, it's
If it's
longer.
under, it's easier, because I can do that summary probate.
Yeah.
Then the third way to do it is some people will do what's called a lady bird deed now, which is basically I transfer the property to myself, retaining the right to live there the rest of my life. But we put in the deed, as soon as I die, the remainder interest, or in simple terms, ownership of the home passes to this person or these kids. And that's another way people are commonly avoiding probate now too. I typically only do that when there's 1 child or maybe 2. But that is another way to do it.
So we recently had some work done with, because the biggest thing that people, I think, is important for people, especially when there's real estate involved in an estate, is making sure that, because trust can read many different ways. I'm sure you, way more than I know. You know more than I do. But if the trust reads a certain way, that the real estate can be conveyed without probate. There's a way to word the trust so we can avoid probate after the death.
Well, if it's in the trust, it avoids probate.
Perfect. A lot of trusts don't include that though.
Well, trusts by their nature avoid probate because the property is held by the trustee for the benefit of the beneficiaries.
Interesting.
So really the only time probate's involved with a trust is typically if there's a minor child.
Interesting. Okay.
Because Florida law, again, has quirky provisions that say if you're survived by a spouse and or a minor child, these are the rules you have to follow in disposing of your house at your death.
So don't die before your kids are 18. So we're good.
Hold out.
That is true.
Yeah.
It is a lot.
Makes it a lot easier, a lot cheaper.
Well, I've got that right now, because right now, if I owned a house in my name and I'm married and have minor children, it doesn't matter what my will says or my trust says. The home passes to my spouse has 2 options. She can take a life estate in the home, the right to live there, and then when she dies, it goes to all my kids.
Yeah.
Or she can claim ownership of half, and the kids get the ownership of the other half. Doesn't matter how old the kids may be at that point. I might have a kid that's 30 and one that's 16. It's all going to go that one of those 2 ways. Then if you want to sell it, I've got multiple sellers. With minors, then I got to get the guardianship court involved to sell it. It becomes a real hassle.
Interesting.
We see some of those. We've had a couple doozies like that where it's really messy.
It becomes really messy and very expensive, unfortunately.
And we get a lot where, I wouldn't say a lot, but we've had multiple where they don't speak to one another. Like, whoever the survivorship is and the siblings. And we just had one. It's our 3rd sale with this family. And the son doesn't talk, one of the sons doesn't talk to the dad or the brother. And so you have to we become counselors.
It becomes more, in situations like that, the trust just makes the most sense because then you can get
Right.
1 or maybe 2 people
Right.
in charge of everything. And
Yeah.
as long as they're reasonable people,
Right.
everything gets done a lot faster.
Yeah.
You still have people
Yeah.
who want a backseat drive, but
Right.
at least you've got one person making the decisions, one person signing the deed, generally
Right.
speaking, and you
Makes
go
it
from
easier.
there. Makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Interesting. If you were to give any other advice to people that are,
Planning.
aging parents or aging people that are trying to make a plan and figure out what is their best scenario to avoid drama once they are passed. Like, I'm trying to coach, my parents, myself, with John having the stroke, it definitely made it like, oh gosh, we got to get our crap together,
Yeah.
what can we do besides the trust? Is there anything else that we're missing?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is do kind of my partner calls it a treasure map, an inventory. What do you own? How is it titled? What is it approximately worth? If it's something like life insurance or IRAs, who are the beneficiaries? And kind of grid that out so you can see where you're starting at. Or if you come to me, I can see where you're starting at,
Right.
number one. Number two, I tell people fewer accounts the better. It's just easier. You know, I'll have people who come in with bank accounts at 20 different banks. It just makes life harder when you
Yeah.
pass. And if you're disabled, then someone's got to go herd all these 20 bank
Right.
accounts up. So once you have the treasure map and you know where everything's at, you can start to simplify, number one. Number two, you can come in to see an attorney or your financial planner to talk about,
Right.
okay, what do we need to do to make this a smooth transition? One, if I have a stroke or I'm disabled, and two, when I die.
Right.
Is it doing a trust? Most people do need a power of attorney and a living will at some point. So it just becomes easier to have that treasure map, have everything organized. I would say after that, then it's implementing it. Too many people come in, I tell them what to do, then they don't
They
do
don't
what they're
follow up.
they don't-
Right.
correct. They get busy golfing, fishing,
Me.
whatever.
Working.
And we're all guilty of
Yeah.
that. It's human
Yeah.
nature a little bit to procrastinate, and it's not
Yeah.
fun to think about, hey,
Right.
I'm gonna die one day or might
Yeah.
have a stroke. I would say after that, for most people down here, assuming they're retirees, sold their businesses, or just, you know, enjoying life down here,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say, you know, your stuff. Number one area I see fights over stuff. You can do a list, say I want this to go there, this to go
Right.
there. It just eliminates a lot of issues. If there's something
Yeah.
you really want someone to have because it makes you feel good, put it on a list.
Right.
If you want to avoid a fight, put it on a list. Most of the fights I see a lot of times are over stuff because somebody
Yeah.
gets the ring and somebody doesn't. Someone's happy, someone's unhappy.
Yep.
And it's not the money value typically, it's the emotional value.
Right.
And I find a lot of times
100%.
people don't want stuff, so there's just those 4 or 5 or 6 things that people just will go to war
Significant
over.
matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
That there's
Yeah.
only a few things, but they do matter.
They're
And
gonna
it's-
dig in. and
sometimes you're like, that's worth nothing, but it is, you know,
it's,
it's an
to them it's
emotional.
worth $1 million.
Right, right,
Because it was
right.
mom or dad's.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I had this before, 2 identical cookie jars. One of them wanted the one on the left just because it was supposedly the one dad took his cookie from every day. I couldn't tell the difference, but
Right.
they supposedly could, and they were gonna battle for it.
It makes sense.
We
though.
get some of those stories
Yeah.
in real estate. We're like,
Yeah.
really?
We
We're going to
sure
fight
do.
over that chandelier?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say after that, funeral instructions are next most common.
Okay.
Do you want to be cremated or not? Do you want to be an organ donor or not? Do you want to be buried in Florida or Indiana? Do you want your ashes scattered in
Yeah.
the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic? You know,
Yeah.
you can write a lot of that stuff out and
And it sure is nice when they are just very clear.
at least
Yeah.
avoid the major arguments.
Yeah. My mom and I talked about this coming back from Ohio. Her friend gave her a whole packet of arranging your funeral.
Right.
And in my family, we're very open, but in a lot of families, people are not. They don't like to discuss it. They don't like to talk about death. And so my mom and I are coming back from Michigan on a plane. We'd had a few drinks. So she's writing it all down. She said, I want this version of the Amazing Grace. And I said, you're not going to be here. It's not going to matter. The lady next to me said, are you really planning her funeral? I said, well, yeah. She said,
Yeah, it's funny. You know, I did have a funeral director once tell me, who just recently passed, it'll be interesting how it turns out. Don't do too much funeral planning because funerals are for the living, not the
Yes.
deceased.
Amen.
And I don't disagree with that to a large
Yeah.
extent, but I think,
Yeah.
but I have had the major fights about this side of the table saying cremate
Right.
and then go down to the Caloosahatchee.
Right.
This side saying, no, we're going to have a
Yeah.
full-on funeral mass, all the bells and whistles, and there's absolutely no way mom or dad are being cremated. So at least some of that major stuff,
The major
I don't
stuff
think
you
it
need
hurts
talk
to
about.
say,
Yeah.
this is what I want.
Yeah.
I would agree. Good stuff.
And I would say
Really
after
good
that,
stuff.
the third thing after that, again, is the treasure map. It's just,
Yeah.
the more organized you are, the better it is, because when people bring me the
Yeah.
shoebox and I gotta figure it out, it just
Right.
takes more time and it increases the bill and
Sure.
That hourly rate.
I do have one other question for you, and this time is flying by because you're a wealth of
Goes
knowledge.
fast, yeah.
So, cars. just in general, is it better to put cars in trust? Is it better to put everything in the trust? Only a few things in the trust?
So cars are unique. They're kind of the exception. Because here's the problem with a car. In the state of Florida, a car is what's known as a dangerous instrumentality.
Dangerous instrumentality.
If a car's in an accident, the owner gets sued and the driver. So what I usually tell people to do is if it's your car and you're driving it 90% of the time, have it just in your name. So that way if it's in an accident, you're the only person who gets sued. Because if you pass and your car goes to a spouse, they'll generally transfer it to a spouse without a probate. And if it goes to your kids, they'll generally transfer it without a probate.
Gotcha.
I just had a panic attack because all four cars are in my name.
You're not going
Well, but what's hard when you have kids,
Yeah.
because, the kids to get the cheaper insurance, your name has to be on the car.
Exactly.
So then you're losing sleep at night. Is there an accident out there?
Yeah.
It's hard.
It is
Awesome.
hard.
Okay.
But cars are kind of a unique
Yeah.
thing. I don't typically see people put them in the trust.
Interesting.
Interesting. Okay.
And cars come and go, and then people
Right.
lease them, and you
Yeah.
don't really put a...
You know what I've learned from all this is just go to Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely make an
Let them
appointment.
map it out
Yes.
for you because
Yes.
I'm lost.
And how do they find you, Kevin? What's the best way to get a hold of you? Email, website?
The best way is just to call my office,
Okay.
936-7200.
Okay. 239-936-7200.
And I'm happy to help, and I've got a lot of colleagues who would be happy to help as well.
You sure do. You have some great people, and we get some great referrals. We really appreciate everything.
Appreciate it.
We love being part of your family and getting to your brothers and sisters. I grew up with them all. Well,
Yeah.
some of them. Some of them are a lot older than I am. Just like,
You're so young.
The
no,
feeling's
but they're all
mutual.
great. They're all great. So thank you so much.
My pleasure for being here. Thanks for having
Appreciate
me.
your time so much. We are Jess and Erin with Best Business Partners here with Kevin Kyle talking all about estate planning. Call us for all of your real estate needs. We do commercial, luxury. If it's real estate, we do it. Call us at 239-744-1944. Thanks for listening.
Decisions. Here's who I want to make